Welcome back to Seek 10-Minute Talks. Today's topic is on the subject of when people say doing the research, or I've done the research, or can you provide a PubMed reference for that, or I'm not even sure if people know there's other journals out there and some people on Instagram. I think
Generally, a lot of people don't know there's another database or other databases for the research. I think the biggest culprit of this is the quasi-scientists who are involved in sports and involved in training. And like we're in this group, we're in the science-based training group, definitely.
I actually was a scientist, but it's continue. It's fine.
And I have a sport and exercise science degree.
Yeah, but I did.
And I have a master's.
I did a real science, but anyway, it's okay. And I worked in a real science lab.
I know you're only at level 8, but someday you might do a master's. So a lot of the time people will quote the research and they'll say, I did my research, or I've really looked into this.
Or I've read the research.
I've read the research.
Yeah.
As if the research is this like static thing that exists. It's a book that you read and you read it once and now you've read the research, and that's really not how science works. We were chatting this morning. Garth was reading some gut biosis stuff.
And I was just kind of looking and I said, I wonder, when did the research start in this? Because the last time I looked at this stuff years ago, maybe close to a decade ago, there was essentially no research, or very, very little research. And the understanding was, the main thing was, we don't understand anything. So that was a huge overwhelming consensus from anyone who would have any idea, was that we understand essentially nothing about it. And obviously that would, with time, change, and there's different implications. And I was just wondering how many studies, for example, on PubMed were published over the years. And essentially there was very little up until about 2012. And then it's just kind of gone essentially exponential. It's been doubling most years. Last year, for example, in 2023, there was, in PubMed, there was 2,904 papers published with the words including gut dysbiosis. So that's not including maybe gut microbiome or related specific strains or anything like that. So we're looking at thousands of different papers, and if you were to say something to Dara like, I've read the research on gut microbiome and it's not a real thing,
Yeah.
you'd be like, how have you read the
That's
research?
a crazy thing. Is like, I remember doing either a nutrition module or a biochemistry module in my undergrad as I was leaving my undergrad, and I remember it being like a passing comment that they're like, oh, there appears to be a link between your gut biome and your mental health, And it was like this crazy thing. It was this thing nobody knew anything about. And that's really the point of today's 10-minute talk, is how dynamic the research is. How much things change, how much the general consensus changes. Even when we have a general consensus, or we have a theory that's now the leading theory of muscle hypertrophy or gut biosis and its relation to mental health, or whatever it is, even when there's a leading theory that most people agree with, there's always differing kind of streams of research, differing opinions on, oh, that might be the main reason, but also there's 5 more reasons it happens. We went and looked up my master's thesis, and for that lit review, there's 2,850 something papers identified, and my master's thesis was very specific. It was the relationship between concussion and then an increased incidence of musculoskeletal injuries in the years following that concussion, and seeing if basically more concussed equals more injured afterwards. So it's very, very specific, and only in the sport of amateur rugby union. So 2,800 and something papers. Then after you identified those papers, 872 papers were read. Then 802 papers were actually fully read. Then 288 of those papers had their record screened, so looking at the results you got from all those papers. Then you get 51 papers where you do full analysis of those, and you might reach out to the people who did those studies and look into them a small bit more. So research is, you simply cannot go and read the research. If I was to pull up the information that's in this thesis right now, much of this information would be void and would be outside the important realms that you'd have to talk about right now. This would have shifted so much in the last 5 years that most of it would be deemed unimportant or unnoteworthy in a kind of current or up-to-date study.
Yeah, I think the I think the funny thing is, and to kind of bring this back again to Instagram comments as we have the last few times on certain different subjects, but it is interesting, is it does muddy the waters, unfortunately, when people bring up something and they'll show like 4 or 5 references, and we'll see it from nutrition and sports science and training, and they'll have a couple of studies, and it's similar to what you might see with climate change stuff. So you'll see a couple of studies that might kind of go against the grain a little bit, and you'll have working theories in sports science that will make sense anecdotally, it'll make sense practically, makes sense theoretically, but the theoretical model might not be proven exactly yet because it's quite difficult to and requires further research. If you look at stuff like, I listened to a lot of Mike Stone stuff recently, and he works a lot with the power development, and he'll openly say for a lot of things, we just don't know. And this is a gentleman who's been involved in the industry both practically and from a research point of view for decades. And he'll say stuff like, we don't know. He'd never make a conclusive statement. He'll say words like, it seems like, or the research would suggest, and we see this and it suggests this, and it's, you'll have like 99% of the relevant scientists involved in climate change will all agree, for example, that climate change is man-made, and then like 5 of them will say it's not. And someone like Rogan will come along and say they don't agree, it's not solidified, where it's like there's a working theory. And for example, we would say lifting weights makes you stronger. And there's a couple of people who might disagree with that, but that doesn't make it a valid working theory when the other people who are in the minority we know to be true come up with their theory. That's the issue. And a lot of times there is an issue in regards to reading studies, and it's not to gatekeep scientific literature. I don't think there's any problem with people reading scientific literature, even if you are maybe not trained in the aspects of reading scientific literature or unexperienced. And a lot of times the issue with reading that scientific literature is, even if you're scientifically literate, you need a good understanding of what you're reading to spot the issues. So you can learn about experimental design, you can have a good understanding of statistics, but unless you have a foundational understanding of that subject, it can be quite hard to interpret the results and easy just to read the conclusion. For example, I could go read engineering papers.
Yeah.
And while I'll have a good understanding of what experimental design should look like in the construction of a scientific paper, I have absolutely no idea realistically of the actual meaningful aspects of a random concrete pump used on oil rigs. What am I going to add to this? But there's people out there who'll come at that from a sports science or nutrition side of things with their own basis, and they'll make sweeping claims based off some of those things.
That's the sweeping claims for me are the big thing, because you get people who have like this knowledge by proxy or intelligence by proxy, where you'll follow a certain person, and I won't name anyone now, but you'll follow a certain person, and that person will say doing isometric work only will increase your strength 60% faster than doing full body compound movements, whatever it is. And now you say, okay, I've heard that person say that person, I believe that person to be trustworthy, and now I'm going to quote that as though it is true. So likely what's happened in that case is that person might have those kind of skills that Owen talked about for reading research, or they mightn't have it. They might have read some piece of research that said that. So in a certain case, in a certain environment with certain groups or a certain cohort, that was deemed to be true. And now you take that information without the relevant context, without the relevant ideas of the mechanisms involved, of all that other stuff, and now you quote that as being true because it's scientifically true. I've read the research, or I've heard the research, and now that 60% quicker claim comes across as being 60% quicker for everyone. And that's the problem. Like, everybody has access to a massive amount of the current studies, or nearly everyone can access most papers now for free. And you might necessarily, or we may oftentimes take somebody's word. So if Gerf is telling me a study about power production in sprinters, we might take his word. We might take that little snippet, because that snippet is the flashy piece we want to hold on to, but we forget about all the other stuff that's wrapped around it, like the groups, like the experimental conditions, like the intervention conditions, and we just say plyometrics are useless for strength training or something along those lines.
While I think I'm just going to finish this a little bit. So while I do think it is, I think it's very important, and I think it is a good thing that there is freely available good literature available to anyone who wants to go and look for it. I definitely am a supporter of that, and that's been kind of a revolution in the scientific community in the last couple of years, specifically from the angle of technically most research is actually state funded, and that state funding is paid for by taxes, and those taxes come from individuals, and so you shouldn't really have to pay for it twice if most of that funding is state funded, so you should be able to charge for that. And a lot of times it's mostly journals charging for these papers and charging an absolute astronomical amount. In a lot of those cases, their peer reviewing process was shown to be incredibly faulty. You should go look up, for example, the Conceptual Penis as a paper submitted to, for example, the some similar psychology or sociology journals that you'd be looking at.
Please don't group those together.
For example, they wrote a paper essentially as a conceptual penis, and it was in complete piss take. But it was included in a journal and peer reviewed and published, and they're similar. It happens a lot apparently in maths where they've done this, where they've made up essentially theoretical maths, and no one essentially is able to peer review it, so it gets published. And I'm sure people in the comments will be aware of some of that. A lot of times you see that in the comments, but I think it's very, very good that people have access to that, because it's very useful for an individual then to go and learn and further yourself and increase your knowledge and your practical implication of that knowledge. I think it's great, and I'm a huge pusher for that. But at the same time, I think it's very important that we do respect people who know what the fuck they're talking about. And I'm not even talking about us here. I'm talking about people in all relevant fields, not just sports science. But when people are well accomplished and who have done decades of research and of experience and do the research and understand it incredibly well, that you actually do respect their opinion and their thought process, and accept sometimes that working theory is almost certainly the prevailing action that's happening.
Yeah.
And it's just take a little bit more time to be proven, but it seems almost certainly that it will be that action, or it will be that theory that they're providing. Because I think sometimes, maybe in the last few years, with the availability of this scientific research, that we get this kind of idea that while you might be peripherally involved in that field or whatever, you then become an expert who can entirely dissuade or disprove everything that this person has worked for, when, of course, in some scenarios, it could be correct.
Yeah.
But the likelihood is more than likely that person who's an expert in that field is probably correct,
The last, my kind of closing point on this would be, sport is inherently results driven. So I think a lot of time, in recent years, as a populace, as a group of people, as we've got more access to information and information is more freely available, we've said that, we've been lied to. So we've been lied to about nutrition, we've been lied to about medications, we've been lied to about education, we've been lied to about all these different things. And now we assume that sport is the same way, where we've been lied to about this stuff, and we're looking for the real reason, right? So like the truth behind back squat periodization or something like that. Sport is inherently results driven. The only thing that matters in sport is winning. And so when you're looking at sports science, and particularly sports science in relation to athletes, not necessarily gen pop stuff, but exercise science in relation to athletes, which most of the time is sports science, most of that data, people are pushing it in the correct direction. It's not like people are covering it up to change something, or they're trying to alter your opinion. Most of the time,
big plyo
plyometrics. Most of the time, people are chasing that data for athletes or for coaches, and that's the big thing you have to keep in mind all of the time, that the researchers here aren't trying to trick you. They aren't trying to get some piece of data put out there that would be inherently false, assuming it's not being done by some company like a foam roller company or something like that.
Yeah, just to, I suppose, converse what Fitz is saying there absolutely is people who are definitely wrong, and there is lots of shit research out there, as we often do with the research papers. We show that they're not always good parameters, but when you do see, you got to use your intuition a little bit.
Yeah.
Taste intuition, taste the flavor of what that person's talking about, and you can think maybe this person who's been doing this 40 years and has coached 17 Olympians probably has a good idea of what they're talking about.
Two things.
Yeah.
Go to Google Scholar and see how many times it's been cited.
Yes.
And see what papers are citing it. If it's like wishy-washy papers that are just doing it for kind of popular
psychology
articles,
papers, yeah,
doesn't matter. Don't worry about those citations. But if they're being cited in good journals, then they're good citations. And the second thing is go to that researcher's or ResearchGate page. And if they've done like 6 papers, then it's not great.
Yeah.
If they've done 48 papers in the last 15 years, they're the ones you want to listen to.
Yeah, if you're something like 90% of papers don't get cited at all, and then if you see a paper where it's been cited like 200 or 300 times, there's a good chance that the evidence presented to you is very useful. If you have any topics for 10-minute talks, let us know. Sometimes we go over, but that happens on 10-minute talks.